Hello! Today I'm returning to the Tekken series with a look at the villainous patriarch of the Mishima clan, Heihachi Mishima. Now, to date, I've discussed several legacy Tekken characters, including Kazuya and Jin, and I'll link to these below. But at the heart of the story to date, and one of the most significant constants to feature in each mainline Tekken game, has been the overbearing foil of Heihachi. And while I wouldn't go so far as to call him the main character of the series, he is certainly among its most important in terms of story and plot, which warrants unpacking here. So, jumping right in, looking to the entire premise of Tekken, the Iron Fist tournament itself, where the world's best fighters convene to battle for prestige and prize money. This was conceived by Heihachi as a means of testing and indeed taunting his son Kazuya to prove his worth as the son of a Mishima. And indeed, Heihachi's tough love approach, if throwing your son off a cliff can even be called that, was the definitive plot point of the early series and shaped the character that turned into an anti-hero and subsequently villain, Kazuya Mishima, very much, and it formed the backbone of the Mishima Bloodline feud that has persisted through the series up until Tekken 7, with its likely conclusion. Now, much like Paul Phoenix, Law, and Lei Wulong, Heihachi is another of these characters that has shifted from a certain severity and sincerity to one of a more comical leaning in recent years. And he's adopted this trademark goofy laugh and several non-canonical endings that sees him dispose of his Mishima relatives in a ridiculous, almost cartoonish fashion, such as strapping Jinpachi, Kazuya, and Jin to a space rocket at the end of Tekken 5. And this sort of thing can cut both ways, because although I do love the dark Faustian leanings of Tekken's Mishima arc, and this reciprocal thirst for revenge between father and son that dictated so much of the early story, I also think the comedic reprieves can be pretty good too. I think there's just a fine balance to have between keeping the comic stuff to less important characters and non-canonical endings is where it should remain, and having Heihachi lean towards the ridiculous in the core story, particularly towards the end of the series, the latter stages of the series. It did conflict for some fans, and the quite dark origins of the first 3 to 4 Tekken games somewhat became diluted along the way. So, just looking back to that and the murky origins of the game, as I mentioned in my Kazuya episode, and also my Jin episode, Tekken 1 saw Heihachi as an ominous final boss, and naturally, owing to the limitations of the time and technology, not much was offered in terms of story or dialogue to flesh him out or contextualise him much, or indeed any of the characters. And I think it is amusing to look back today to see how the limitations meant that his voice was kind of Jack's robotic sounds, and his moveset was a very limited adaptation of Kazuya's and some of Paul's and others. But nonetheless, he did serve as an enigmatic and intriguing final boss that was canonically thrown off a cliff by Kazuya at the end of that game. Moving on to Tekken 2 and looking at Heihachi, this was the first indication that Tekken was on a different narrative trajectory than other fighting games of the time, because rather than maintaining Kazuya as a heroic or central character, we now re-entered the tournament from Heihachi's perspective, who, having survived the fall, is now out to revenge himself against his son and claim back the Mishima Zaibotsu. And so we see these characters not so much as clear-cut heroes and villains in black and white, but operating very much in shades of grey, that later diversified even further with the introduction of Jin in Tekken 3, who I recently discussed. And all things considered, I think this is a really interesting way to craft a game story, because despite all the ruthless things that Heihachi does, whether it's throwing Kazuya off a cliff, adopting and discarding Li Chaolan, shooting Jin in the head at the end of Tekken 3, his character is so well developed and interestingly developed, you're generally hard pushed to find a fan that hates Heihachi, and quite to the contrary, because so many characters and events are adversely impacted by his ruthlessness, such as Michelle Chang, Jun Kazama, so on. He is in many ways the narrative heart of the series, around which everything orbits, up to and including Tekken 7. And despite his obvious and sometimes cartoonish villainy, the strength of his story and strength of his design, including his visual, aesthetic design, his voice acting, and indeed his moveset, means that fans have tended to gravitate towards him and quite enjoy Heihachi's role within the Tekken game world. Now, moving into his characteristics and personality, Heihachi, much like Kazuya and Jin, may be perceived in any number of ways. As we've mentioned, Heihachi has done some pretty ruthless stuff in his past, particularly to his son Kazuya and his grandson Jin, but at the same time, by the time we arrive at Tekken 7, there is scope to suggest, within the retcon story at least, that looked at a certain way, Heihachi could be considered a redemptive or perhaps even a sympathetic character, and this roots back to what he sees as the necessity of destroying the devil gene within the Mishima Bloodline, starting with the quite tragic betrayal and murder of Kazumi, his wife, and later his attempts on the lives of both Kazuya and Jin through the fear of what they would become. And I suppose, yes, there is a certain sentimentality to those scenes within the Tekken 7 story, but at the same time, I wouldn't say that this outweighs the ruthlessness of Heihachi's character or makes him in any way sympathetic or redemptive. For example, the actions such as locking his father Jinpachi beneath Honmaru, who wasn't even tainted by the devil gene, his recklessness in adopting Li Chaolan just to provoke Kazuya, and everything his Zaibotsu does to negatively impact other characters and wider society, such as the aforementioned Michelle Chang and so on. Heihachi isn't really what we could call redeemable, but he does maintain a certain code and a certain set of principles, looked at a certain way, which are very Spartan and survival of the fittest in practice. And indeed, just returning to the premise of this tournament, it is about the best fighting the best and the strongest surviving. Beyond that, Tekken 3 sees him seek out the ogre for personal power, and even throwing Kazuya off a cliff in childhood rather than outright killing him is yet again testament to this determinism and this sort of pursuit of strength and power that Heihachi has. So in many ways, Heihachi embodies values and traditions of early pre-war generations of Japanese, but this is meshed together with the later corporate-driven values of a post-war and technologically innovative Japan. Specifically, we can identify philosophies of Stoicism and Bushido in his aesthetics and his outlook as a martial arts practitioner. He is clearly a character that is anchored to traditions of self-mastery in accordance to a martial code, and yet he is also heavily driven by corporate greed, as witnessed by his actions and expansionism of the Mishima Zaibotsu over the course of the series. And while Zaibotsus are business structures that have existed in Japan for hundreds of years, I think design-wise it's very telling that Heihachi's Player 1 and Player 2 costumes are generally split between plush contemporary business suits for his Zaibotsu side and this persona, but also traditional combat attire for his other outfits, such as a karate gi, the sarashi bandages that he wears in Tekken 4 for example, and these other outfits that link him ostensibly with older Japanese practices and traditional martial arts, such as karate. Also on the note of design, as mentioned in my Kazuya episode as well, is that the Mishimas have their own style of karate, which has strong similarities and correlations to the real-world Shotokan karate. And Heihachi's standing stance in particular resembles the Kakutsu Dashi stance, and more so than that, where Shotokan karate's official symbol is a tiger, so too is Heihachi's design, often coupled with the motif of a tiger, which lends itself to this particular brand of martial arts and branch of karate. So, before wrapping up, it's worth touching on the conclusion of Tekken 7's story, because where we've discussed Heihachi as at best a grey character and at worst a villain, there was, despite that, quite an emotional aspect to his final showdown with Kazuya, and as a long-time Tekken fan that has grown up with Heihachi and Kazuya's story on my game consoles and in the arcade, there was something quite sad about seeing what may well be his last appearance in a canonical Tekken game. And I think the way they displayed that conflict of emotion passing between father and son, almost as if there was a reluctance to fight one another at times, it was really quite a moving tribute to this character and Heihachi's legacy, and this dominating figure of Tekken's story, who it seems has finally been defeated by Kazuya. And personally, I think it's going to be quite weird not having Heihachi in future games, because he's been such an integral part of Tekken from the outset. And while many think that he might reappear in Tekken 8 in some capacity, I feel like the way that they framed the story and set up such an epic showdown in the volcano between Kazuya and Heihachi, and also after that, where they've clearly set up a showdown between Jin and Kazuya, it feels like that really was quite a conclusive ending. It doesn't feel like he's going to be back anytime soon. And after such an emphatic conclusion to Tekken 7, it would cheapen it if they were to bring back Heihachi, at least in the next instalment. So there we have it, some thoughts on one of the most important characters and architects behind the Tekken storyline between games 1 and 7. If you got this far, thanks very much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it. And feel free to drop a comment below. Let me know your thoughts on Heihachi Mishima and what seems to be his final inclusion within the Tekken story.